So, what information is contained on a settlement instruction? This possibly looks similar to you from the trade confirmation that we looked at earlier, but it's got typically fewer details in it. So this is from AM Company New York to its custodian in Paris, that's custodian X. You would quote on there your account number over which you want the movement to occur. Why do you need to do that? Because typically every firm will have more than one account number, and we can maybe discuss later on why there will be different accounts. You would also quote your trade reference number, actually for the same reasons that we discussed earlier, that for STP reasons you need to know your trade reference number so you can update the details of the trade within your own trade records. You would need to indicate whether you wish to deliver or to receive. Now, it's important to say that for securities, when you say deliver or receive, you must refer to the securities and not to the cash. So an E01 O1 signifies receive, right? So you're telling, the message that you're sending to the custodian is telling them, and I'd say telling, not asking, telling them to receive the securities into your account. And the settlement basis is P, delivery versus payment, as opposed to F, free of payment. Quantity, 1 million. The particular security is represented by the unique ISIN code for the security. The settlement currency, so in this case sterling, and the settlement value just over £1 million. The value date, now what does this mean from the custodian's point of view? It tells them not to settle the trade prior, not to even attempt to settle the trade prior to that date. On that date at the earliest, later than that date if it fails is also fine, but not earlier than that date. And the counterparty's account number, which is also the same account number as appeared on the trade confirmation that we issued, and that information has been copied and pasted from static data. So this has come from the counterparty SSI that we were holding within static data. A couple of things to point out. Let me just read through this. The method of communication to and from custodians must contain a satisfactory level of encryption in order to avoid fraudulent instructions that have been issued by third parties. For this reason, fax is banned by some organisations as a medium for issuing settlement instructions, as it's considered to be insufficiently secure. This is a real risk for financial institutions. The size of transactions and the value of positions that are held by your average financial institutions is typically in the hundreds of millions, and if not into the billions of dollars worth of value. So this is the sort of situation, if this is the investment bank here and this is its CSD or custodian here, what you'd want them to always do is to ensure that when they receive an instruction which says it's been sent by this particular investment bank, you want them to act very, very carefully to ensure that it really has been issued by the investment bank. And for that reason, because if you issue settlement instructions by a medium which cannot be authenticated, it is a very, very dangerous thing. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the method by which settlement instructions may be issued. So by what deadline must instructions be issued? Well, this will absolutely differ according to the market or even the particular custodian or CSD that you're using. Here's an example. In UK time, at the end of any day, 6:45 PM, this is the evening before value date, is the deadline that Euroclear, based in Brussels, would accept for receipt of settlement instructions which have a value date of next day. That will be the case if you issued by Swift or by Euroclear's Swift equivalent proprietary system, which is called Euclid. But for the same value date, if you were not using Swift and you're not using Euclid and you're using some other method, then Euroclear will quote to you 10 AM. Now that's approximately 9 hours earlier than if you were sending by these electronic methods. And why is that? Because what Euroclear will say is that they require manual intervention over anything which is sent in a non-electronic format. And in fact what they do, they do one level of input and then they do a second level of input by another person. If they match, they are regarded as being correct. Okay, so as a general rule, you should try and issue your settlement instructions in a drip feed way during the trade date. Having said that, if in your organisation, if you execute trades not in just one market but in multiple markets where you've got different settlement cycles, so on any one day, new trades that you execute, in some cases they're T+1, in other cases T+2 and T+3, clearly it would be more important to focus on the nearest value date, the T+1s out of those. So it's a case of prioritising. The other thing that you would need to do, by the way, is to take account of time zone differences, particularly if you're trading in markets around the globe. Should instructions be issued during the day or at the end of the day? Because of the risk of systems failing at end of day, I would suggest that you should issue periodically during the day in case of system problems. So by what methods can settlement instructions be issued to custodians? Well, a short time ago we spoke about Swift, but when we were talking about Swift then, we were talking about trade confirmations. We spoke about an MT515. But these Swift message types here are all settlement instruction types. You can see they're all MT5 something. This means that they are securities type messages. So if you had bought an equity trade or if you bought an equity or a bond and you wish to settle DVP, which as we know is the norm, you would issue an MT541, which tells your custodian to receive securities on a DVP basis. If you had sold in the normal way, an MT543 to deliver securities on a DVP basis. And you have the equivalents here, the 540s and the 542s are the free of payment equivalents of those. So therefore, you would expect that the vast majority of settlement instructions you issued would be 541s and 543s because those are DVP settlements. You could also use the CSDs or custodians' proprietary systems as well, Euclid being one of them, Euclid for Euroclear that is. Which system is responsible for issuing settlement instructions to custodians? Normally it's the operation system, but what many firms have for backup purposes, in the corner of the office they will have some form of PC which gives a direct link to the systems of the CSD or the custodian that you are using. So what are the risks? Well, one risk is that you do issue an instruction but you miss the deadline that's been defined by the CSD or custodian that you're using. Now what does that mean then if you miss the deadline? Well, that guarantees really that if you're buying you will fail to pay the seller on time, and that would mean you would need to compensate the seller with no recompense to you. So if you were a seller, if you turn this around the other way and say if you were a seller you are keeping to your side of the bargain, you have matched instructions, you are able to deliver, but if your counterparty, the buyer, has not input their instruction, because settlement instructions require matching before settlement can occur, this means you won't have achieved a match, which means settlement won't occur on value date. And as the seller, you should say, I was able to deliver, but I didn't get paid. Why? Because the buyer had not input their instruction. So that would be a valid claim by the seller for loss of interest. If you were the seller then, and if you failed to input your instruction by the deadline, this means you are failing to receive cash on time, assuming DVP settlement this is. And this means that there will be no recompense to you, but a potential benefit to the buyer in the sense that the buyer, if all they were doing were buying and they hadn't on-sold, they're still the owner of the securities that they've bought. It's just that they don't have possession of them yet. So what does that mean on DVP settlement? It means that the buyer is not required to pay the cash as early as they originally thought. So if it settles on value date +1, so they've held on to that cash, let's say, for 1 day. So that's described as the buyer has use of funds. And it really depends what the buyer does with those funds as to whether they can make those funds work for them. If you issue an instruction but has in fact not been received by the destination, by the depot or the nostro, by the custodian, is the same as the above. So what can you do about that? Is there a control that you can apply? Well, yes, there is. When you issue an instruction, you can request acknowledgement of receipt by the destination, and that could be automated. So you say, today I believe I've issued 5,000 settlement instructions. Have I got 5,000 acknowledgements? Well, if you haven't, it implies that one or however many have gone missing. So you need to do something about that, because obviously if you don't have a settlement instruction at the destination, the trade is at risk of not settling. If you issue free of payment instructions without internal authorization, so this is another type of risk. What many firms do is to say, if you are to go on risk as a firm, then you need someone extremely senior within the organisation to authorise the operations department to put the firm on risk, actually. So with your operations hat on, I would say you should only ever put your firm at risk. You should only ever issue a free of payment settlement instruction which puts the firm at risk if someone extremely senior has given you written authority to do so. And if the answer is they haven't, then I would say do not instruct. That would be a really dangerous thing to do. And finally, falsified instructions. If you've got someone out there that is attempting to disguise themselves and pretend that they are you, the investment bank, this could be extremely bad news, because if they do successfully input an instruction which makes it look like it's come from the investment bank, you might find to your cost that actually $20 million worth of securities or cash, or even worse, or even a larger amount than that, has been removed from your account at the custodian, and it wasn't even you that instructed it. So this is potentially without limit here. Having said that, if any such horrendous situation occurs, then it's really important that you identify it, that the investment bank identifies such a situation as quickly as possible. How do you do that? Through the process of reconciliation, which is what we'll be discussing at the end of the trade life cycle. Let's move on to the subject now of pre-settlement statuses. So let's assume that our situation is that we issued a trade confirmation, that we know that the counterparty has agreed it, we've issued a settlement instruction to the custodian, and now we are eager to hear back from the custodian what the status is, whether it's matched or unmatched. So a pre-settlement status is a condition that's applied to a settlement instruction by a CSD or a custodian, depends who you're using specifically, which reflects the matched status of your instruction. Of course, we need the instruction to be matched because it has to be matched prior to settlement. How are such statuses derived? So following receipt of a settlement instruction, the custodian attempts to match the investment bank's instruction with the counterparty's instruction. The possible statuses are that it is matched. Now, so within the heading of match then, can you have different levels? Well, yes, you can have this level, which is the details of your instruction and your counterparty's instruction match perfectly in all respects, inclusive of the cash figure, the cash settlement amount. But you can also have, or instead have this status, that all details match apart from the cash value, but there is a difference which is within a tolerance. Now that tolerance is set by the CSD. Now in the case of Euroclear in Brussels, that tolerance is $25 US. So in all other respects, the details of the settlement instructions between the two parties must be the same, apart from the cash value, which can be different by up to $25 US or currency equivalent of that amount. So if you've got a difference of $12 US, then it will be regarded as matched. On the other hand, your status would be unmatched if all details match apart from the cash value, and if the monetary amount is more than $25 or currency equivalent, or you've got completely missing instruction from the counterparty. So this would be a situation where you have issued your settlement instruction, there is no matching, there is no equivalent instruction, let's say yet at least, from the counterparty. And advisory or alleged is the other way round, where actually you haven't issued an instruction, that there is a party, potentially a counterparty, that's issued an instruction which is alleging the trade against one of your accounts. And it remains to be seen whether you recognise that trade or not. So obviously this is the status that you want matched, but you could find some of your instructions are unmatched, and you may have some of these as well, preferably a limited number of these. Okay, so the possible statuses then. Let's use this chart to identify what the possible statuses can be. Right, so just to explain the basics of the diagram, here is trade date, and we're assuming T+3 value date. So this is the date, this is the all-important date here, value date. And the dates in between trade date and value date are represented by value date -2, value date -1 before you reach value date, and we also go beyond value date as well. So, and here are the possible statuses: unmatched, matched, settled and failed. So just to explain, if you visualize a situation where we have executed a trade and now we have issued a settlement instruction. So if today is the trade date, we've issued a settlement instruction, and our instruction we know has been successfully received by the CSD that we're using. If there is no matching instruction by the counterparty, from the counterparty, then our instruction will be given a status of UNM, meaning unmatched, with a priority of 2. unmatched, hopefully you can see that that makes sense. Why a priority of 2? Because it's not as urgent as a priority of 1 and it being unmatched, and that's because of the number of days it is away from the value date. So it's a priority of 2. Now, if trade date is today, we've issued an instruction, it could be this morning that it is UNM2, but later on that day the counterparty issues an instruction and there are a number of attempts by the CSD to match our instructions intraday. If the CSD then discovers that there is now an instruction from the counterparty, and if it matches, then our instruction will be given a status of FUT, which means matched with a future value date. So that's the maximum status that we can get before value date. Now, it can't have settled yet, and it can't have failed, because the earliest point that settlement or failure can occur is the value date. Okay, so if today we've executed the trade, we've issued an instruction, it's unmatched, and it's still unmatched tomorrow, it will retain the same status, UNM with a priority of 2. If later on that day the counterparty inputs an instruction, then it will go to FUT, not applicable, not applicable. If, though, we now get to value date -1, and if our instruction is in with the CSD, but there is still no matching instruction from the counterparty, it'll still be UNM, but now the priority moves up to UNM1, otherwise known as urgent unmatched. So now this is getting particularly worrying, because value date is the next day, and even though it won't be our fault if settlement failure occurs because of a lack of matching, we're likely to go to the trouble to pick the phone up to the counterparty and say, what's happening with your instruction? And hopefully they'll say, we are inputting it now, and that could then result in us achieving that. It still, though, cannot settle and it cannot fail because it's before value date, the important date here. Okay, so if it was unmatched right the way up to here, and now we reach value date, and if it's still unmatched on value date, it will retain the status of unmatched with a priority of 1. So you cannot get an unmatched status with a greater priority than 1. But that, if you get that, it means that the trade is failing. It's already failing. Now, on this row here, matched, it's not applicable now. Why? Because we've reached value date, and on that date, if you have matched instructions, then it will either settle or it will fail to settle. Okay, if it fails to settle, here these are known as reason codes. So what does CSEC mean? This means that C, that's counterparty, is insufficient of securities. So that means that we would be buying. The reason for failure to settle is because the counterparty cannot deliver the securities. Just to be clear, you would only get that. You'd only get these statuses, these fail reasons, if you have matched instructions. If you don't have matched instructions, it will remain like that, which means that it cannot settle until a match has occurred. So CSEC means the counterparty is insufficient of securities. USEC means that that's we, are insufficient. So this means we are selling. We don't have adequate quantity of securities to deliver. That's the reason why settlement is failing. Okay, so these two failed statuses here are securities related. That means the seller is insufficient of securities. Of course, we could be the seller or the buyer, depending upon if we are, which way round the trade has been executed. And these two statuses here relate to the cash. the sequence that the CSD operates in, if I'm the CSD and here's the seller and here's the buyer and there are matched instructions between them, the first thing on value date I will do is to ask the question, does the seller have an adequate quantity of securities? And if the answer is yes, then I'll look at the buyer's account and say, and ask the question whether the buyer has adequate amount of cash to pay. The answer could be yes there as well, in which case I will allow settlement to occur. But going back to this, if I ask the question, has the seller got adequate quantity of securities to deliver? If the answer is no, then clearly there's no point in looking to the buyer, because I'm not going to allow settlement to occur if the seller does not have sufficient quantity of securities. So therefore it's sequential. So in other words then, these two statuses here of OTH and PROV. OTH means your counterparty cannot pay, and you'd only get that status if you as a seller were able to deliver securities. And PROV is the other way round, which is that you are insufficient of cash. This means that the counterparty is able to deliver securities but you cannot pay. So these statuses have real meaning and should really be used actively and proactively by the party that receives such statuses. And just lastly on this diagram, if we look at value date +1, if your instruction was unmatched on value date and it's not been matched since, then it will retain a status of UNM1. So now this is really costing somebody money now if you reach this situation. But you can still have settlements occurring on value date +1 and beyond, and you can still have failure occurring on value date +1 and beyond as well. So anything which is unmatched we need to give focus to, and anything which is failing we also need to give focus to. In some cases those failed statuses are bad news for us, particularly when selling. If you can't settle a sale, it means you're not going to be receiving cash, but there are cases that where you're buying and the seller cannot deliver to you, then that is actually an opportunity to make more money unexpectedly, because you're simply not having to pay on value date. So what must occur when unmatched instructions are identified? Well, to be frank, this is a similar situation as what you would do with having identified an unmatched trade confirmation. I would suggest firstly that you prioritize trades into, number one, trades with an imminent value date. So value date, let's say next day. If you don't prioritize those, you could simply lose cash. You could lose money as a result of not processing them with any urgency. You could, as a second priority, identify trades with particularly large cash values. So within an investment bank, you might say, we do lots of trades which have a value of $25 million or currency equivalent. But you could say that if you handle hundreds of trades like that per day, then you wouldn't consider those trades as being exceptionally large. So you might therefore say that any trade that is above $30 million US or currency equivalent, you would want to give particular focus to. So that's the sort of treatment you could give to large cash value trades. And three, then anything else. But you could apply another priority to this, which is that if recently for a particular client they've been unhappy with your service as an investment bank, then you could also then apply any trades with that particular client as a priority. So having then prioritised trades along these lines, for example, then what you could do is to determine the nature of the difference. So is it a front office component, as we mentioned before, under trade confirmation, or is it an operations component? So is it an SSI problem or a cash value calculation problem? Of course, if it's front office, as we said before, if the trader says, yes, sorry, wrong quantity, I agree, I made a mistake there, then the amendment needs to come all the way back down the chain from the top as an amendment. What you must avoid doing is giving any opportunities for trades to be amended either in the operations area without also being amended in the front, or in the front without also amending in the back, because all the time the front and back must remain synchronized. So if it's a front office component, you need to contact the trader, so they will state whether the details of the trade as booked is correct or not, and also whether we should contact the counterparty. It could be that our booking is incorrect or the counterparty's booking is incorrect. Okay, if it's an operations component that's the problem, if you've got an SSI difference, we need to ascertain whether this is a one-off change, as I mentioned a short while ago, or whether this is a permanent change to their SSI. And if it is, then we need a formal communication coming from the counterparty. It is dangerous actually to change a counterparty SSI just on a say-so, as opposed to having something in writing that states formally that there is a change. So the root causes of unmatched instructions then. Typical causes: our trader miscaptures one or more trade components. That could be the case. Just as easily, the counterparty's trader may have miscaptured one or more trade components. Particularly difficult if both our trader and the counterparty's trader both miscapture details. We've got missing securities within our static data. This will slow down our processing, make it non-STP, and so therefore the counterparty's instruction could arrive before our instruction arrives. Same thing for clients and counterparties. Basically, in our static data, these two things are similar in terms of the effect that they have in the speed of processing. Inaccurate or out-of-date SSIs held within our static data. That may be the case, but what can we do about it? Well, the attempt to match instructions is one way that we might discover that we've got an out-of-date SSI. And incorrect calculation of cash values. I've seen this happen thousands of times. Accrued interest is a favourite thing for parties to calculate differently. And it really depends on the quality of information set up within a firm's securities static data, because that's where information about coupon date and coupon rates are held. Action. Let's now talk about the subject of failed settlement. Now, the reason that we're talking about this now is because, of course, if a trade does fail to settle, it will fail before it eventually settles. So that's why we're talking about it before we talk about the act of settlement. So what is it though? It's a securities trade in which the associated securities and or cash, and normally it would be both securities and cash if DVP settlement were the way in which this particular trade was due to settle, have not been exchanged with the counterparty on value date. Just to remind you what value date means, it's the intended date of settlement. So the intended SD, otherwise known as the contractual settlement date. Unfortunately, that abbreviation is the same for Central Securities Depository, but here it means contractual settlement date. So a couple of important concepts to discuss about this. Do trade cash values change as a result of a trade not settling on its value date? No, if you are buying, the cost to you remains the same. If you're selling, the proceeds that are due to you remains the same. Therefore, both parties, the buyer and the seller, are locked in to the original trade cash values. Are ownership rights affected if you have a trade that is failing to settle? No, ownership remains the same. You have a contractual commitment that exists between the buyer and the seller, and settlement is only delayed. So the word failed may be taken by some people to mean that it's cancelled. It is not cancelled. It's just that the trade, it will still settle, but it has not settled on its value date. Therefore, we are expecting it to settle at some point later than value date, but we are still expecting it to settle. It's not cancelled, definitely not cancelled. Trade cancellations do come into play, but it requires the agreement of both parties to the trade, the buyer and seller. The impact of failed settlement. So monetary loss is one impact. So the primary aspect of this is that if you were selling, in fact you could say if you were selling any goods at all, any commodity at all, your focus, I would suggest, when you reach the point, the day that settlement is due to occur, is to make sure that you do what's necessary to get your hands on the cash. Now, in the case of securities settlement, what that means is that you need to make the securities available for delivery as a seller. By making the securities available for delivery, and if we assume DVP settlement, that's your best chance of getting your hands on the cash on value date. But where the seller fails to deliver on value date, so if I'm selling to a particular counterparty, if we can have matched instructions, and if value date has been reached, if I do not have the securities available, then, and if therefore I cannot make the delivery, that in itself will prevent delivery versus payment settlement from occurring. That means I'm denying myself the opportunity to receive the cash at the earliest date, which is the value date. And therefore the implications of that from a seller's point of view is a cash interest loss. So if we say that the sale proceeds of a trade are, for example, 5 million euros, the difference between receiving 5 million euros as sale proceeds today, the value date, and tomorrow, value date plus 1, the difference is the interest impact. So if we receive the cash today, the 5 million euros, we could utilise that cash. We could, for example, lend that cash and earn a rate of interest on it for one night, tonight. But if we don't receive the cash today, we simply cannot do that. So therefore it will cost us that opportunity to earn interest. Now another aspect to this is that if you were a buyer and you had a failed settlement, if I'm a buyer and if I had bought from that party and had also sold to this party, if this party fails to deliver the securities to me, then I therefore, on the face of it at least, cannot settle this transaction here, my sale. So there is an impact there as well, and generally speaking there's an increased exposure to counterparties, and this is in this day and age of concern to any financial institution. So there are risk managers, risk departments within investment banks and in other types of financial institutions too, who are constantly looking at all trades that they have outstanding with counterparties. Now, it's true to say though, if this is your trade date here, and this is your value date here, you could have thousands of trades outstanding from trades that were executed on the trade date, but you have not yet reached the value date of those trades. Now, those trades are validly outstanding with counterparties simply because value date has not been reached. What we're talking about here, though, are trades which are beyond value date now. They should have settled on value date. They didn't settle on value date. So therefore you have an increased exposure to counterparties over and above those trades which are validly outstanding. Okay, so do failed settlements occur in all markets? The answer is no. You really need to look at this on a market-by-market basis. So in some markets, the rate of successful settlement is 100%, meaning that it's normal that all trades with a value date of a particular day will settle on that date. And the reason for that is because there is a fining regime that is imposed by the local authority, by the national authority, the national regulator, to say that if you fail to settle a trade, there will be a fine involved. And that normally results in 100% success. But not all markets are like that. In other markets, failed trades are a daily occurrence. So, for instance, in the world of Eurobonds, where settlement occurs at the two international central securities depositories, that's Euroclear in Brussels and Clearstream International in Luxembourg, fails are a daily occurrence. You would typically have somewhere to the order of, say, 95, 97% of trades which are due to settle on a value date typically do settle on that day. So it leaves a small, say, between 3 and 5% of trades that typically fail to settle. So what causes failed settlement? The first principle is this. This is a very important concept, that unless your instructions are matched, settlement will not occur. If you think back to the statuses diagram, if you had an unmatched instruction and it remains unmatched up to through value date, beyond value date, settlement simply cannot occur. But I would suggest that that's logical. If you were a CSD and you had a buyer and a seller and they've each issued you with instructions, clearly if one party says receive 1 million of securities and the other party says deliver 10 million, what's the CSD supposed to do? So there has to be a matching process. So that's an important thing, which is why firms should focus on unmatched instructions. That's very important to get any unmatched instruction resolved before value date. Also before value date, so pre-value date. Why are settlement instructions not matched? Well, they could be because there are missing instructions. So you could have input your instruction, your counterparty has not input an instruction. It could be the other way round to that as well. It could be that there are differing instructions, meaning that you've input your instruction, the counterparty has input their instruction as well, but there are differences. This could be different quantity, different security, different value date. It could be that both of you are saying receive, or both of you are saying deliver the securities. Well, clearly that is one valid thing where it needs to be in the opposite direction to be matched. But if we now go beyond value date, so on and after value date, even with matched instructions, settlement can still fail. So let's just be clear about that. If you don't have matched instructions and you reach value date, settlement cannot occur. If you do have matched instructions, that is only the first stage in achieving settlement. So having matched instructions does not guarantee settlement. So let's move on to the next step then. Assuming that we have matched instructions, if the seller has insufficient securities. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's say, for example, you have sold 10 million of a particular security, so that's a quantity of 10 million. If you've got actually zero quantity in your account from which delivery is due to occur, nothing's going to happen. If you had, for example, 2 million in your account, that delivery still will not occur unless partial settlement is automated within a particular marketplace. But for example, in the Eurobond marketplace, if you had 2 million and you have sold 10 million and you have matched instructions and value date has been reached, settlement will not occur of any of it at all. So the first step then, seller has insufficient securities. For that reason, settlement will fail. If the seller does have sufficient securities, so let's assume that you do have 10 million or more sitting in your account and you want to deliver the 10 million to the counterparty and receive the cash, well, it's possible that the buyer has insufficient cash. And you may remember previously we said that this is sequential. This is 1 and that's 2. So the CSD will look to the seller's account first. Does the seller have adequate quantity of securities? If the answer is yes, fine. They will attempt to deliver to the buyer, but they will look at the buyer's account to see whether there is adequate cash. And if the answer is yes, settlement will occur. If the answer is no, then not only will the buyer not pay, but the seller will not deliver either. Failed settlement would result. So what can be done to prevent failed settlement? Well, here's a number of suggestions as to what you could focus on to maximise your chances of settling on the value date. That you need to make sure that instructions are issued for all trades. So if, for example, if you've executed, or if your firm has executed 1,000 trades today, then let's say by the end of today, have you issued 1,000 settlement instructions? You might have actually issued 999 when you should have issued all 1,000. So this might be a sensible check to ensure that you've issued all instructions that you should have done. Second step, instructions that have been issued are received by the custodian or the CSD, whoever it is that you're using for settlement. How do you go about ensuring that? What some firms do is to seek acknowledgement of receipt. So this is you here. You send a settlement instruction here. This is the destination, a CSD or a custodian, and you seek acknowledgement, an electronic acknowledgement coming back, which confirms to you that the instruction has actually been received there. If you don't go to the trouble of doing that, you cannot be, I would suggest, 100% certain that there is a settlement instruction out there representing every single trade that you've executed. The next one, deadlines for instructions are not missed. Now, all CSDs and custodians will state their deadline for receipt of instructions relative to a value date. These days, you have CSDs that do typically both overnight processing. I mentioned in one of the previous slides that the deadline for overnight processing at Euroclear was at 6:45 UK time, but that is only for the overnight processing. These days, you can come in on the morning of value date, see that a failure has occurred, and with the agreement of your counterparty, you can actually settle the trade intraday. But this does require specific agreement with your counterparty and resubmission of settlement instructions with a daylight settlement indicator on there. So that is absolutely possible. The only thing I would say about that is that you might settle the trade now through daylight settlement, so actually your trade has settled. My question would be, is what cash position does that leave you with? Are you able to move the cash to your benefit? And there are deadlines associated with the movement of cash as well at CSDs and custodians. So I would suggest that you need to look further than just settlement of the trade. It's the impact on your management of your cash as well. Any unmatched instructions are resolved before value date. So in all financial institutions, it's normal to have people, sometimes sections of people, maybe 3 people, 10 people in some cases, maybe more, who are focused on looking at reports from CSDs and custodians that they're using to see which trades are currently failing and for what reason, and they, for example, pick the phone up to the counterparty and discuss with them how to get this trade matched. In some cases, it would be your own firm that needs to make an amendment in some way. In other cases, it would be the counterparty who would need to make an amendment. But the urgent unmatched report is a critical report, and if that is not given adequate focus, a firm could end up losing considerable sums of money. Securities sold are in the correct account by value date. Now, most investment banks, for example, at each CSD or custodian that they're using will have more than one account in which securities are held. It is therefore possible that the securities that you have sold are not in the correct account. So 2 accounts here. This is where the securities are currently held. This is the account, though, that you told the custodian that you wish to deliver out from when you're selling. If you don't make sure that those securities are moved from this account into that account, they're just 2 accounts that you own, and that will be a free of payment movement, by the way, no risk there, both accounts belong to you. You would only successfully settle the trade on value date if you recognise such a situation and you make sure that you transfer the securities free of payment from that account to that account in readiness for settlement on value date. Okay, we're now moving on to another major area, which is that securities are borrowed when you are short. So this is, you have sold securities, you have an insufficient quantity of securities available. What many firms do, but not all firms, this is up to the individual firm, this is not a regulatory requirement in any way, is that as a seller, where you cannot deliver securities, what you could potentially do is to borrow those securities. And obviously the word borrowing implies that you're going to have to return them. That's a fact. You are literally borrowing them from another party for which you'd be paying a fee and for which you must return them. So what you're not doing is to buy the securities. So borrowing is a temporary arrangement with a lender. How you can borrow securities, well, there's that you can do it directly between yourself and another party. It's just a different transaction type from buying and selling. But you could also take advantage of the services that the ICSDs provide, Euroclear and Clearstream, where they provide automated securities lending and borrowing. But that is a whole subject which we will look at separately later and outside of the securities trade life cycle. So, and settlement is effected on a net basis wherever possible. Generally speaking, and historically, individual trades, so here you've got individual trades that you've executed, these are normally settled one by one on a gross basis. But if all of these trades are in the same security, and if all the trades have been executed with the same counterparty, then you should be able to agree with the counterparty to net the all of these trades together into one single delivery or receipt of securities against the netted amount of cash. So generally that is regarded, that settlement on a net basis is regarded as a highly efficient way of settling. Will failed settlement occur if the seller has some of the securities available for delivery? So this is otherwise known as partial settlement. So in some markets it's compulsory. So in the situation that I described before, you've sold 10 million, you have 2 million in your account. In some markets, the 2 million will be delivered and will therefore be part of the 10 million. So that will be the 2 million against the pro rata amount of cash will be delivered, and that is a market standard in some markets. But in other markets, it's by agreement between buyer and seller. So in a situation where you've sold 10 million, you have only 2 million available on value date, and you are the seller. In a market where partial settlement is not automated, then an option for you is to call the counterparty and ask them whether they will accept partial settlement of 2 million out of the 10 million against the pro rata cash amount. From the buyer's perspective, they reserve the right to say, no thank you. But it really depends on the situation you're in as a buyer. So let's say if I'm a buyer and I have bought 10 million and I have 5 million from some other transaction sitting in my account, and I've sold 7 million and the value date of that has been reached, I need 2 million in order to successfully settle the 7 million. So if I have this other party calling me saying, will you accept 2 million partial delivery? Yes, absolutely, because that will then enable me to complete settlement of my sale of 7 million. But the buyer has the right of refusal. So, but if partial settlement is agreed, so as a seller you've contacted the buyer and the buyer said, yes please, then you would need to go through this process once partial settlement has been agreed. So the available quantity of securities will be delivered against a pro rata cash amount. So if we go back to our example, 10 million were sold, you have 2 million available, counterparty will accept the 2 million. You would need to split your existing settlement instruction. That's both parties have instructions for 10 million which are currently matching. That 10 million needs to be cancelled and be replaced by a quantity of 2 million against a pro rata cash amount and the remaining 8 million against the remaining cash amount for the overall trade. And then and those instructions from seller and buyer will need to match, and as soon as they're matched in the next settlement process, then the 2 million should be delivered from yourselves to the buyer, and then on a DVP basis you deliver the 2 million and receive the pro rata cash amount, and the remaining 8 million against its pro rata cash amount would simply sit there as a matched instruction. Failing, yes, And what could then result is, if you then receive 8 million, you could then deliver the remaining 8 million. If you receive another quantity, something less than 8 million, 5 million, for example, you could then again call the counterparty, call the buyer, and say, will you accept a further partial delivery of 5 million? And if they say yes, you go through the same process again, and that would then leave you 3 million left to be delivered for the trade. So just to be clear, the trade, the 10 million trade, remains intact. What you're doing is to satisfy settlement of that trade by multiple deliveries and payments. Whereas normally it's one delivery versus one payment. This is multiple deliveries versus multiple payments. Okay, it is important to remember this, though, that the original trade remains intact. The trade itself is not being split in any way. It's only settlement of the trade. So what can be done to enforce settlement? So if you are, let's say you're a buyer and you are desperately in need of the securities that you've bought because you've been pressurized for delivery by someone that you've sold to, the ultimate measure that can be taken in any market is a process called buy-in. So this involves, now in every market there is there are buy-in rules and procedures that must be followed. So typically you would reach a point either on value date, so going forward in time, on value date or after. So in some cases this could be, for instance, 2 days after value date is the earliest point when you can effect a buy-in, where you can start a buy-in process, that is. That at this point you issue a communication to your counterparty saying, I'm giving you a further, for example, 3 days to deliver. If you fail to deliver by the 3rd day, or on the 3rd day, then we will invoke the buy-in procedure. So first of all, you then give them a chance. It's like a final warning, if you like. And if they have delivered to you in that time frame that you set, fine, then settlement would have occurred. Okay, it's occurred late, but it has in fact occurred. If they don't deliver to you, then it would still be up to you, but then you could enforce the procedure. And that normally involves appointing a market maker. You ask them whether they would be willing to act as a buy-in agent. You tell them about the trade for which settlement is still outstanding. And let's assume that that market maker says, yes, I'm willing to act as buy-in agent should it be necessary to do so. And so if you then go beyond this initial period here, if they still haven't delivered, you then say to the buy-in agent, okay, I wish to enforce settlement through the buy-in process. The market maker will go and buy the securities from another party. Those securities get delivered to the market maker and then forwarded to yourselves as the buyer, and that is now settlement of your original purchase. Any additional costs which are incurred by the market maker will be chargeable to the seller, the party that's failed to deliver. So in some markets, this is the buy-in process is seen as a quite a normal thing to do, but in other markets it's taken as a more Okay, now let's talk about the subject of settlement, so trade settlement itself. What is trade settlement? It's the passing of securities and cash between buyer and seller. externally by the firm's CSD or custodian that it's using. So just to be clear, if this is the firm here, so if this is the investment bank, as we know, settlement instructions have been issued by the firm to the CSD or the custodian, and it's where settlement actually occurs is at the CSD itself. The different forms of trade settlement are typically DVP. This is, you would expect any financial institution to want to settle their trades ideally on a delivery versus payment basis, the simultaneous exchange. And that's because it's considered to be risk-free from the perspective of both the seller and the buyer in terms of whether you are giving an asset without at the same time receiving the contra asset. Okay, free of payment is the alternative to DVP. So free of payment, firstly, without risk. Sometimes this is referred to as upon receipt. This is riskless from the seller's perspective, for example, because if the arrangement between seller and buyer is that the seller is not required to deliver the securities before receipt of the cash, then the seller will not be at risk. From the buyer's perspective, though, this means that if you were buying and you were settling a trade FOP without risk, it would mean that on value date you were not making the payment of the cash cost first. You would wait for delivery of the securities to come into you from the seller first, before you then make the payment. But with risk, and this is a real risk for a financial institution, if you are executing a trade for settlement on a free of payment basis, where you are incurring a risk, this would mean that as a seller, you would be delivering the securities, so you would instruct your CSD or custodian to deliver the securities on value date to the buyer without you knowing whether you would have received the cash, the sale proceeds that were due to you. Clearly that's risky, and I would suggest that no one would want to do that under any circumstances for any form of transaction, inclusive of securities. If you were buying, this would mean that you'd be paying the cash on value date without knowing whether the securities were being delivered to you on that date or not. So to go on risk, and this is a procedural point from an operations perspective, to go on risk, the settlement department should utilise procedures to gain internal approval. The sort of thing that may be done is that someone senior within the organisation is required to sign, to put their signature against the requirement to go on risk. So somebody like the head trader, for example, and I would suggest that from an operations perspective, that you do not issue any form of instruction when it comes to FOP with risk like this without first having authorization from someone very senior within the organisation. So this is a procedural point, but one that I would very strongly recommend is adopted. How are trades settled? So we know that instructions need to be matched before value date. We also know that you need to take corrective action on any unmatched trades as quickly as possible prior to value date. Then, but assuming that you have matched instructions, then on value date, the CSD would operate its settlement cycle, and therefore this is what would is necessary to be in place before settlement can occur, that the seller has the securities available for delivery in the account from which settlement is due to occur, and that the buyer has the cash available. Assuming that to be the case, when settlement occurs, it's simply, if I can just indicate through this, if this is the CSD and this is the seller's account and this is the buyer's account, then when settlement occurs, the securities will simply be delivered from there to there, and the cash would go in the opposite direction, of course. There is no physical movement of securities or cash. This process is known as electronic book entry. So as far as the CSD is concerned, it's taking securities from one account and moving it to another account, and it's taking the cash in the opposite direction simultaneously, I would add, without any physical movement of securities or cash. Is it possible to settle trades against different cash values between the buyer and the seller? In some CSDs, it's possible to settle the cash aspects of a trade against a settlement tolerance. Now, that is $25 or currency equivalent at Euroclear. When we spoke about this, by the way, in an earlier module, I was saying that this would be classified as a matched instruction if there are cash differences between sellers and buyers' settlement instructions. But this is the next stage on from that, which is settlement. So settlement will occur against different cash values, but only up to a maximum difference of $25 or currency equivalent of that. And by the way, it will settle against the seller's cash figure. So if you are the seller and there is a difference of, for example, $18, your figure will be your cash figure that you've calculated will be the figure that the monetary amount that the trade will settle against, which is fine. You've been expecting to pay to receive a certain amount, and you will have received a certain amount. But what it means for the buyer, though, is that the buyer is expecting to pay a certain figure, but if there is a monetary difference up to $25, it will settle against the seller's figure. So what I'm coming to here is that you will have potentially different actual settlement amounts as a buyer from the amount that you have recorded in your trade record. But it's a relatively small amount, and what many firms would do is to simply automatically write off such a relatively small difference. The next step is reflecting settlement, and what is meant by this is to take your books and records, so the trade record that you have that you recorded at trade capture, very close to the beginning of the trade life cycle. At the moment and up to this point, the trade that you have in your books and records has a status of open, meaning not yet settled. Therefore, there's exposure with the counterparty as well. But now, settlement has occurred. And actually what you will receive from the CSD or custodian that you're using is an advice of settlement. And now you need to update your internal books and records to reflect the fact that the trade has settled, and also to reflect the fact that you have no exposure for this trade, that is, with the counterparty. And this is a very important step because it actually brings your books and records into alignment with the reality that's actually in the outside world. So, do trades within your books and records require updating as a result of settlement? Yes. This will align your books and records with the reality in the outside world. An extremely important aspect of trade processing, and one that is sometimes underestimated in terms of its importance. In the US, this process is very often referred to as cleanup. So you're actually cleaning up trades that you have internally with the current status of open. They are no longer open because settlement has in fact occurred. And the accuracy of the resultant books and records. So I would emphasise resultant books and records after you've reflected settlement against the trades that have settled. You'll be able to prove this through the process of reconciliation, which is our final subject of the securities trade life cycle. How do you achieve that? Well, by reflecting individual settlements as advised by your CSD or custodian that you're using. What you'd actually receive are settlement advices, which will state the individual instruction reference number, which should have that should be the same number as your unique trade reference number. This is a very important aspect if you want to automate this and to achieve STP in the update, because if this is your custodian down here and this is you or your books and records, then information is coming up to you. It's being fed to you by the custodian or CSD that you're using. So a settlement advice will be issued or made available to you so that you can interrogate your accounts, let's say, at the CSD or custodian. And the main criteria that's used to link a settlement of an individual trade here and the trade that you've got sitting with a status of open here is the unique trade reference number. And when you issued, if we just think back a few steps, when we issued a settlement instruction here, on the settlement instruction the settlement instruction would have contained the unique trade reference number. So that was sent by us to the custodian. What we now need reporting by them is the fact that the trade has settled, also quoting the unique trade reference. So that's the link that we need to update each of the individual trades which have in fact now settled. So within internal books and records, what we did at Trade Capture, so right at the top of the process, was we created a trade record. Initially that had a status of open. In fact, it would still have a status of open right up until the point that we reflect settlement internally. That status of open meant not yet settled and we had exposure with the counterparty. So this is the view of the trade record that we looked at immediately upon trade capture earlier. So this is what we looked at earlier, the trade details, which are along this line here. The trade reference, trade date, trade time, value date, so that's the intended date of settlement, which trading book, whether we're buying or selling, the quantity, in this case, a particular equity, the price per share, the counterparty with its location, and the cash value that we calculated as well. And at that point in time, the status was open, right? So we didn't know back on trade date what the actual date of settlement was. And this is intended to indicate that the 12 million shares that we are due to receive because we were buying have not yet been received, and that the cash that we're due to pay because we were buying has not yet been paid. But now, as a result of reflecting settlement, then we can complete the settlement row here, the settlement details row. Sorry, Mark.
Say that again?
Well, it's this thing that's... Right, can I go back? Yeah. Right, so now we know that we can complete the settlement details row. So, and this is typically what's been completed. the trade reference, which has been reported back to us effectively by our CSD or custodian. So obviously you would expect that to match with the trade reference. The settlement date, which is actually the 24th of October, which, as you can see, actually is 1 day later in this example than the value date. Now, as we mentioned before, in most cases you'd expect the settlement date to be the same as the value date, but I've just decided to put an example here showing that this trade failed to settle for 1 day. Also, we have received, right? So this is from a settlement point of view. If you were buying, you would receive the securities. If you were selling, you would have delivered the securities. So this is saying that we received 12 million, which is all of the quantity that we bought. If you chose to do partial settlement, by the way, that figure there might say 3 million was settled on this date, leaving 9 million outstanding and still to be settled. Well, of course, this is the same security as we bought, and we're saying that those securities were delivered to us by Deutsche Bank in London, our counterparty, and furthermore that we paid just over $34 million, which is the full purchase cost that we had previously calculated. So in this example then, I've introduced a third row here called outstanding, and there we will see that in terms of quantity we have nothing outstanding. So everything was delivered. Everything that we bought was delivered on that date, the 24th of October. And also, from the cash point of view, we've got nothing outstanding, which means that we owe nothing. So therefore, from an exposure point of view with this counterparty, Deutsche Bank in London, there is nothing outstanding for this trade, neither in terms of quantity of securities that need to be delivered or received, or in terms of cash that needs to be paid or received. So what this actually shows then is a single delivery and payment, and that is normal. Where you have partial settlement occurring, you would then expect multiple rows of settlement details.
Welcome to Trade Settlement and Failure Resolution. In this activity, you'll apply concepts from Section 5 of the course to simulate and troubleshoot real-world settlement scenarios. This hands-on learning activity has 5 steps. You'll begin by drafting a complete settlement instruction using core trade details. Then, you'll review a failed trade and determine how to resolve unmatched settlement instructions before the value date. Next, you'll simulate a partial settlement, including the correct steps to update instructions and manage ongoing exposure. You'll also update internal records post-settlement and understand why reflecting settlement is so critical for reconciliation. Finally, you'll identify the top causes of failed settlements and outline measures to prevent them, including when to initiate a buy-in. Let's get started and apply what you've learned in a hands-on way.
Of reconciliation. Just a general word about this. Reconciliation is a primary control that all firms should operate. In my opinion, there's nothing more important than being able to reconcile. And what you're attempting to reconcile is that your books and records are accurate when compared with the outside world. So that's the way that you prove that your books and records are correct. But what is reconciliation? Generically speaking, it is the agreement of one set of records to another, a fundamental and essential control. What purpose does it serve? It ensures that internal records of securities and cash balances are accurate when compared with custodians' records, yes, But we're going to see it's not only that, it's more than that. What types of reconciliation exist? Well, here are the names of what are, in my opinion, amongst the most important reconciliations. The FOBO, front office, back office, in other words, front office and operations, trade reconciliation. This is one type of reconciliation. This focuses on whether the trades that have been captured within the trading system. So just to be clear, front office, trading system, that is, operations here. What you're checking is that if you, whatever trade you've executed and have captured in the front, you've got exactly the same population in the back. So this is not a difficult control. It is, though, in my opinion, fundamental and very important that this control is carried out. So you're comparing individual trades that are captured within the trading system against the operations system to ensure completeness of trade capture. So the sort of thing that this reconciliation would reveal is whether, so in operations we have 5 trades that we've captured. Do we have 5 trades? Is it the same 5 trades that have been captured in the front? And the answer, let's assume, is yes. It could be actually that this shows that we've only got 4 trades captured in the back, where 5 were captured in the front. That would indicate that there's a problem maybe with the interface between front and back. It's also possible that there's been some form of amendment or cancellation which has occurred in one of the systems but not in the other. It's essential that these 2 systems remain synchronized. And that is the real value in carrying out this type of reconciliation. So that's one form of front to back check. Another form of front to back check is a FOBO position reconciliation. So what do we mean by this? Well, if you have, let's say that all of those 5 trades that I've indicated here have been captured were in the same security. Some of those were buys and some were sales. You would have expected that the brought forward position from the prior day would have been the same for both front and back. So if we assume that reconciliation was done and they were the same the previous day, then these new 5 trades would have impacted the position. So what position do we end up with? So let's say, just very quickly, we had a brought forward position of long 10 million, that is. And these are the trades here. What do we have? We had a further buy of 2 million, a further buy again of 3 million, a sale of 7 million, a sale of 2 million, and a purchase of 5 million. Now that should give us a total of what? 10, 12, 15, 20, minus 9. So that's plus 11. That should be our closing position in both the front and the back. So this is where these 2 reconciliations work together, that if you know that you've got the same population of trades in the back as in the front, then really this should be easy to reconcile. This should not be a problem. But I would suggest performing both of these reconciliations on a daily basis if you want to remain completely in control. So this reconciliation needs to be done at individual securities position level, and actually it's more than that, to be honest. It's also by trading book as well. Now a trading book, you could have more than one trading book that holds a position in the same security. So it's not only important to do the security level, it's important to do it at security level within book, within trading book. Moving on. So in parallel with this, so these should occur on a daily basis. And these other reconciliations should also occur on a daily basis in the same time frame. What is known as a depot position reconciliation. Now, if you remember what we said in an earlier section, depot equals securities, not cash. Further down here, we'll come back to this and talk about this reconciliation, but this is cash. So we're only talking of securities balances, and that is securities balances with CSDs or custodians that you are using. So you're now looking at settled securities positions within the operation system, and you're comparing that against the statements of securities holdings that are provided to you or are accessed by you from custodians and CSDs. If we take an example of a CSD, so you've got an account at Euroclear, account number 55527, for example. This is your account. On a daily basis, what Euroclear or any CSD or custodian will provide you with is a list of settled positions. So this is, in other words, positions which result from the act of settlement. And quite simply, in that account number, it will state the quantity of what you're holding and the individual security. So it would state, for example, if we talk about bonds, same thing applies to equities, you've got a positive position of, say, 23.6 million of this particular security, which is IBRD, that's the formal name of the World Bank, with a 5% coupon maturing 1st of March 2030. So that's an individual bond security represented by a particular ISIN number. And what Euroclear is telling us that right now they are holding that quantity of that security in this account of ours. That's what they're telling us. And they would have another balance here of a security. They are long 5.1 million, for example, of Xerox Corporation common stock. This is equity, that's a bond, same concept. So this information is being provided by the CSDs and custodians that you are using, and what ought to happen is that you are comparing this. These are, I would emphasise, settled positions here against what you're holding in your books and records. Now, some people are of the opinion that you don't need to do this every day if you're not trading every day. But of course, most firms do have trades and settlements which occur every day. But even if you didn't have settlements occurring every day, it is still a valuable reconciliation, because unfortunately there are people out there that would love to get their hands on your assets, and so the value of reconciling is to ensure that what you believe you have and are being held at places like Euroclear, that the assets are actually there. If you don't reconcile for 1 month at a time, if you think what could happen during the space of 1 month, those securities could have disappeared out of your account. This is not a major task to perform this, particularly if it's done daily. But the value in doing this daily is that you would, if there has been any attempt at fraud or a successful attempt at fraud, then identifying the fact that your assets are no longer where they ought to be gives you a far better chance of recovering those assets than not discovering that they're missing 2, 3, 4 weeks after the event has occurred. So I'd really recommend that this is done daily. Okay, so to put into a single diagram those reconciliations, you've got over here the trading organisation, so you can take this to be an investment bank or a pension fund, it's the same thing. And what you've got here is trading system, trade capture, what needs to occur before settlement, then settlement has occurred, and then the resultant balances that you have in both securities and cash. So if you like, that's the information which is available within your operations area for reconciling. So what would a CSD or custodian provide to you? Well, the first thing that they know, of course, is that they would have received from you a settlement instruction. So let's assume that has occurred. Then before settlement, so pre-settlement, if you say to yourself, you believe, according to your books and records, that you have trades that are outstanding and are not yet settled, how do you prove that? How do you prove that's the case? So you look at a trade internally and you see, in my opinion, this has not yet settled. That's what you're showing here. How do you know that how can you reconcile that to prove that's the case? By settlement instruction statuses that are provided by the CSD or custodian that you're using. So if you have, if you think back to the statuses that we looked at earlier, if you have a status of FUT, that is telling you that the counterparty has matched your instruction, but the trade hasn't settled yet because it has a future value date. If you have a status of CSEC, for example, CSEC, that is telling you that the counterparty agrees that they owe you the securities. That status means counterparty insufficient of securities. You won't get that status unless you have a matched instruction. So those are what I would state, the pre-settlement statuses are what I would recommend to use in order to be assured that what you are showing as trades not yet settled, that is agreed by the outside world. Then you have the act at the CSD or custodian of settlement itself. You would receive a settlement advice from the CSD or custodian that you're using, and as we saw in the reflecting settlement section, that we would then have updated the individual trade records to show that they're settled, and that results in an update to your securities position and an update to your cash position as well. So how do you prove that those balances of these two assets are correct? Well, you basically take the statements of cash and securities that are provided or that you access, and you make a direct comparison of your asset balances against their asset balances. And if you did this daily, even if you find a discrepancy, a break between what you have and what the CSD or custodian is showing, at least you've only got a possibility of an error occurring going back 24 hours. That's all. Much better situation that than needing to go back 3 or 4 weeks. Why should reconciliation be performed urgently? To ensure that different records within your systems agree for both trades and for resultant positions. Also because business decisions are dependent upon accurate information. So if your books and records do not reflect the fact that a trade is failing to settle, if your organisation uses your books and records to in some other transaction type, for example repos, which we'll be discussing at a later stage, you could be believing that you have securities available to give as collateral in a repo when in fact they're not there, and this is dangerous to do that. So you really need your books and records to be 100% accurate at all times, and the only way that you can make sure they are is by going through the process of reconciliation. Also, for funding, in other words, most investment banks need to borrow cash in order to fund their inventory of securities. Again, if your internal information is not accurate, you think you're going to go and need to borrow $100 million when in fact it's $150 million that you need to borrow. So very important that books and records are accurate. Another reason, simply this: it is basic but sensible business practice to ensure that your systems and your books and records absolutely represent the truth, the reality of the situation. How frequently should this be performed? Well, in my opinion, daily. One real advantage is that you are identifying any errors or even attempts at fraud which may have occurred very, very quickly after they've happened. You certainly would not want to wait days or weeks before discovering that there has been a real problem, that assets have been removed from your account without your knowledge, for instance. So how would you go about performing a reconciliation? Just generically, you'd obtain statements, either internally, so comparison of front versus back, for instance, and back versus external, in other words, CSDs and custodians. You would first of all, number one, need to agree the brought forward balance, in other words, the balance from the prior day. Now, if you'd reconcile on a daily basis, then hopefully that won't be a problem to do that. You would then need to reconcile the individual movements, and from that then identify the breaks, the non-reconciling items. You need to check on internal statements. So in one of the places there will be a movement which has not occurred on the other statement, and you need to find out whether that movement is valid or not, and if it is valid, then you need to replicate it within the missing system, within your books and records, for example. And that requires investigation and resolution of those non-reconciling items. Very important that that's done quickly and efficiently to bring your books and records back to where they need to be. What methods are used to perform reconciliation? Historically, this would have been done manually. Anything manual, of course, is error prone and also takes time, whereas if you were to do it in an automated way these days, I mean, there are dedicated reconciliation systems that are out there where once those systems have been programmed with the parameters that you decide to utilize in the reconciliation process, so this is your internal against the CSD's records, let's say, and here is the reconciliation system, then it's a case of pressing the button and within a matter of seconds you'll get the results of that. Now the advantage in that, let's assume that you end up with 10 items that are breaks, they're not reconciling. The big advantage here is that you would identify the fact that you've got these breaks at say 9 o'clock in the morning as opposed to 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which is my experience of doing this reconciliation task manually. and that's a big number of hours that you that are a bit worrying if you can't reconcile. What do you need to do then when a discrepancy is identified? Without delay, you need to identify when you could last agree. So you need to go back to where both balances, where the balances were one and the same between the two things that you're comparing. And then you need to compare individual entries since that last time. And that's going to reveal that there is where the difference lies. So you need to identify this point, contact the appropriate department. Now, so what could that be? It could be the traders. It could be that a trader's been captured in the front but not in the back for some reason, or even the other way round would be a possibility, particularly where you have amendments and cancellations. Now, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet throughout the trade life cycle is the subject of corporate actions. A very big subject in its own right, but your positions can be impacted by corporate actions. You had a holding of 10 million of Xerox Corporation shares previously. Now you've got 20 million. Why? Because there's been a form of corporate action called a stock split, for example. So your position has been impacted, but not because you bought any more or sold any more, simply because of a corporate action. So those types of actions alone can be the reason why you may not be able to reconcile. You need to gain agreement over the rectifying action according to what the particular problem is. You need to document the agreed action and monitor to ensure that the agreed action is effected. Now, the sort of thing that can happen is an operations person agrees with the trader that the trader will make an amendment to a trade and then fails to do so. The trader fails to do that. This needs to be monitored, I would ensure, if you want to act efficiently, and you need to chase up the relevant person or department if those changes have not been made. You need this, once you've identified the discrepancy, you need to take corrective action really as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you'll end up having an ongoing break for days. Okay, so the advantages of a centralised reconciliation function. Well, for a start, segregation of duties. It's regarded as a fundamental, not very good control if you have people carrying out settlements, for example, and having those same people perform reconciliation. So segregation of duties, where you've got a dedicated reconciliation function separately from the settlement function, is what most firms have in place these days. So this in turn allows focus on reconciliation tasks unaffected by any other form of workload. So if you have not got this segregated situation, and this is the kind of thing that will occur, is that you know that reconciliation needs to be done now. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, but at the same time you've got some urgent settlements to do. A decision needs to be made. If you've got a segregated department, that should not come into contention at all. And it also provides ownership of the reconciliation process. It is a fundamentally important control. So in many firms, it has been recognised as being so important that it does require a separate function. The risks of failing to reconcile sufficiently frequently are basic loss of control. I mean, to me, this is one of the most important things that can be done. Even if it means stopping trading for 2 days or a week. I know that sounds like an extreme measure, but if you are out of control in a reconciliation sense, you might be jeopardising the ongoing existence of your organisation. It's that fundamental. And if you have a fundamental loss of control, what you don't know is whether, and this is just one example, whether securities or cash had been moved from your account without your knowledge. It's a highly fundamental and dangerous situation. Completo.
Welcome to Reconciliation Methods and Risks. In this activity, you'll practice using concepts from Section 6 of the course to perform trade reconciliation and explore what happens when records break. This hands-on learning activity has 5 steps and takes 60 minutes. First, you'll compare front and back office records to identify breaks in trade capture. Then, you'll investigate a mismatch in shareholding and consider how to trace the cause using statements from custodians. Next, you'll simulate the impact of a corporate action and identify what updates are needed to keep positions accurate. You'll also define different types of reconciliation and explain why they should be done daily. Finally, you'll reflect on risks and controls, including how poor reconciliation can lead to funding issues or even loss of assets. Let's get started and apply what you've learned in a hands-on way.
Hi, I'm Paul Siegel. I am one of the creators of this course, and I hope you really enjoyed it as much as I did creating it. We worked closely to try to create a curriculum that made sense, that was really practical, and that was relevant to someone in your shoes, someone who is learning something new or expanding their knowledge of what they've just been doing, but really wanted to brush up on. The goal of these educational pieces is to keep them rather simple, not to do high production value content creation or with lots of bells and whistles, but to really get to an instructional experience where you might be sitting in the classroom, which is how most of us have learned our entire lives. Yes, the virtual world has changed much of that, but at the end of the day, it's all about working with and learning from a top quality expert. And that's what we've hoped to do. In this program, you will see that there are many examples. There are many practical tips and tools that you can use, hopefully, after you go away from the program, but we're adding more content all the time, and we're trying to do that so that it's effective. So what I'm asking you to do is leave comments, message us, message me, and we will be able to get you more content, more relevant exercises, and more practical things that help you use this course as a tool on an ongoing basis, not just the one time you go through it, but you want to come back to it because we'll add more exercises and things to help you do better at what you're doing right now. I want to point out that sometimes, as I mentioned, there are imperfections in a course. There are pops, there are clicks, the sound sometimes get muffled because an instructor happens to have covered their microphone by accident, or it slips off or something like that, or the camera person gets out of focus, or all those sort of things. I think the fundamental truth about education is it's partially what you learn in the classroom, but it's partially about altering the way you think about problems. And as anyone will tell you, you go to college or you go to a training course, not so much to gain what you're going to learn in the course, but to think about the problem differently. So I hope that for the most part, our courses do communicate how do you solve problems. We are doing our best to add more exercises and quizzes and things that give you the hands-on talent and knowledge and skills that you need to perform effectively. But more importantly than anything else, I hope you step back, think about what you've learned, and try to apply that in the real world. And I think you'll find that most of our programs, if not all of them, do that. They're really hands-on and practical, and they're trying to give you good insights into how to become more effective in your career.